UFC's pay-per-view numbers are reportedly way down, according to New York Post's Eric Rickner. Rickner's report indicates things are much worse than we ever imagined, and the UFC's exclusivity deal with ESPN for their negotiations just ended on Tuesday, April 15th. Since the UFC moved its pay-per-views to ESPN+, mainstream visibility of the UFC has dropped significantly, according to Rickner. He says ESPN has basically stopped airing it on their cable networks like ESPN, ESPN2, and ABC. ESPN Plus has become the hub for UFC content, but if ESPN is not showing it on their mainstream cable network, it seems, or would indicate, that ESPN no longer sees the UFC as a marquee or main event for their product. The UFC pay-per-view buy numbers are also considerably weaker than they have been in recent years. Rickner claims that they are well under 300,000 buys per event, when big events used to easily break 500K and sometimes even breaking 1 million buys. And this also goes hand in hand with the increases in pay-per-view price since they've joined ESPN. If Rickner's claims are accurate, this indicates that UFC's mainstream popularity is steeply declining. This may mean the pay-per-view model is weakening and no longer valid, with almost all of the markets moving to a streaming deal versus paying per event like we do in North America. Currently, if you're in the United States and you pay for ESPN Plus and you buy every pay-per-view event, you will pay well over $1,000 just to be a UFC fan. This may indicate people aren't willing to pay that much for fights. With questions of the UFC's star power in recent years, it may indicate that fans are no longer willing to pay that premium. If these reports about pay-per-view buys being well under 300,000, as Rickner claims, then pay-per-view points for fighters, especially big ones, big names, the few that the UFC does have, are not as lucrative and not as worth going after, and indicates they're not going to get as remotely near big a payday as they would have in the past. This is something that Dana White would brag about in the past, and fighters would even brag about getting in their contracts, and now it simply isn't lucrative enough, and fighters aren't going to get this. This could make it harder for fighters to justify their long-term loyalty to the UFC, even though you could argue the UFC has a pseudo-monopoly on the MMA world. On ESPN, UFC has been a marquee main event sport for them, but most people would agree that football, especially the NFL, was going to take precedence over them in a lot of the airing times during prime time. But now, it's not just football, it's basketball, and many times college basketball getting priority over the UFC. This could also be a larger signal that ESPN isn't considering them again for a long-term deal or re-signing their current deal, because there's also rumors of Netflix potentially coming in or someone else. But if this is true, ESPN is treating the UFC no longer like a tentpole organization, but sidelined as a secondary filler sport for their programming. As mentioned earlier, the UFC's exclusivity deal with ESPN, the contract negotiations, ended on April 15th, last Tuesday. That means the UFC can start fielding offers from other organizations like Netflix, CBS, whoever, if they don't re-sign the end of a 7-year deal with ESPN and the UFC. UFC leadership is reportedly looking for over $1 billion per year for UFC's content. This would be a massive increase in the rights deal for the UFC, who seemingly is looking no longer like the main event at ESPN, which could signal to other people to not even remotely go nearly this high for the next deal. Netflix is rumored to be one of the big players interested in signing the UFC to a new rights deal. This is indicated by their move into sports like F1 and the WWE, who, specifically the WWE, is partly owned in a collaborate company we've covered on here, TKO, Endeavor Group, etc. The question is, will Netflix adopt a pay-per-view strategy? There's no indication that they would, and the few times they've streamed live events, it's been hit or miss with their streaming technology. And even if they did adopt the pay-per-view model in some way or some manner, it's going to mean huge price increases to subscribers or a different plan entirely. And this friction is going to cast doubt on a deal with them. If you've been on the internet as an MMA fan over the last couple years, you've seen these opinions, you might have them, you might agree, that the UFC's product is greatly watered down. They're doing more events at the Apex. They're not having as many stars. They're doing more events most people don't tune into. The claimed decline in quality seems to align with the UFC signing to the Endeavor Group and joining TKO, merging with the WWE in this weird corporate structure, and we've talked about this, seemingly a way to extract wealth from the UFC's product while declining cards to keep costs low, pay fighters less. As you know, fighters are paid under 20% of revenue. But the decline in perceived quality is probably playing a large part in the decline in sales of pay-per-views and probably ESPN Plus subscriptions, which could have indicated to ESPN to stop pushing the UFC as we get closer to the deal. Not only if they intend to re-sign with the UFC, they could use this as leverage. If they don't intend to sign with them, why keep putting any energy into the product? The main point of this all is that the UFC is probably going to be negotiation from a point of weakness if Rickner's reports are true. If pay-per-view buys are down, if ESPN is not using them as a marquee event anymore, if quality is perceived as lower. Do you think the UFC is going to re-sign with ESPN for over $1 billion a year? Or do you think Netflix is going to take a risk in new sports programming following the Mike Tyson, Jake Paul fiasco and sign with the UFC and go all in on combat sports? Let me know below on your predictions on what the UFC is going to do. And do you think the UFC is declining? This has been a collaboration with the MMA Draw. If you enjoyed this, check out their Substack. We will be linking to it below, and we'll be doing more videos with them soon.